All right. We'll start, and hopefully Mrs. Aldridge can hop in with us. Hello, everyone. Welcome to an intergenerational conversation on the legacies of educational liberation in Detroit, with a focus on African-centered schools. My name is John Blake. I'm the graduate assistant in the Department of Africology and African American Studies. I'm also a full-time high school teacher in Port Huron, and I'll be your moderator for this evening. Education for Liberation is an extension to the Africology and African American Studies Department's larger Black History Month speaker series, where we'll be hosting conversations centered around education, liberation, activism, and the arts with community leaders. In closing out the series will be Music and Movement in Detroit. This will take place on Thursday, February 24th at 5:30. It will be hosted by my colleague, Ashley Reynolds. Ashley, give a wave. Thank you. For more information on the speaker series and to register for specific events, please visit our department website at emich.edu/AAAS. Also, Dr. Blackmer mentioned that these will be recorded, and he's posted them on his YouTube page. So our last series, which was not last week, but the week before, has been posted. We'd like to take this time to an opportunity to thank our co-sponsor for the event, the Aspiring Educators of Michigan. Your contributions are greatly appreciated. AEM's president, Ariana Jaria, would like to offer some brief remarks about her organization. So,
hi, thank you so much. So I'm Ariana Jaria, she, her, and I'm co-president of the Aspiring Educators of EMU. Thank you so much to Jonathan Blake for coordinating this event, and thank you to our advisor, Dr. Peter Blackmer, for getting AEM involved. So we're really excited for this event and to learn effective ways to include Black liberation, both in and honestly outside of the classroom. So Aspiring Educators of EMU is a student level chapter of the organization Aspiring Educators of Michigan. We're focused on professional development and networking for anyone involved in education, majoring in it, or just interested in becoming a teacher. So we work to plan events like this one or get involved with events similar to this. So if you're interested in learning more about the organization, please fill out the interest form. I'm going to send it in the Zoom in the Zoom chat. And yeah, please send it to anyone else who you think might be interested. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That is over in the chat. We're going to begin tonight this event with a roundtable discussion with our esteemed panelists. Please, at any point, feel free to put your questions in the chat box located at the bottom of the screen, and remain on mute until called upon. I believe we will be, Dr. Blackmore, Dr. Jones will be looking through the questions and helping get those out and asked. Audience participation is greatly welcome, and we're hoping that we can have a little involvement so it can be more interactive to all of you. Now to introduce our panelists, did Mrs. Dewberry Aldridge get on? Did she make it on?
Yes.
Okay. All right, I will introduce you first then. Dorothy Dewberry Aldridge is a native of Detroit and is among the longest serving members of Michigan Coalition to the Human Rights, which I will refer to as the MCHR. Her civil and human rights work began in the 1950s with the NAACP Youth Council. During the 60s and 70s, she served as director to the Student Nonviolent Coordinated Committee and worked with such noted persons as Stokely Carmichael, Hubert Rapp Brown, Mrs. Rosa Parks, Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, and Miss Ella Baker. In the 1980s, through working with the MCHR, she organized and led bus tours of civil rights movement historic sites in the South for young people from Metro Detroit. These tours took young people to Birmingham, Montgomery, and Selma, Alabama. Albany, Georgia, Memphis, Tennessee, and other places where the movement's battles were fought. She also served as the chief guide for the Detroit Freedom Tours that visited historic sites locally, both here and in Canada. Mrs. Aldridge was active in part as a result of her work with Moore's South Africa Committee in the anti-apartheid protest and the African Liberation Support Movement. She was also very active in MCHR's South Africa Committee in its early years. She also recently served on the MLK Planning Committee for the last few years. Most recently, Dorothy has been active in MCHR's Film Committee and Annual Film Committee and was a key planner and chaperone of the 2003 Freedom Tour. Mrs. Dewberry Aldridge is married to fellow activist and our next panelist, who I will be addressing, Reverend Dan Aldridge. They have a daughter and a grandson. Mrs. Dewberry Aldridge, thank you for being with us tonight.
Well, thank you for having me.
Appreciate it. As I mentioned, her husband, Reverend Dan Aldridge, is the chair of the Woodward Avenue Community Development Corporation. Reverend Dan Aldridge was born in Harlem in 1942 and grew up in New York City. He attended college in Tennessee, where he was involved with the civil rights movement alongside legendary organizers like Diane Nash, James Bevel, and Marion Barry. Arriving in Detroit in the mid-1960s, he was affiliated with the Student Nonviolent Coordinated Committee and became active in various stages of the Black Power movement in Detroit. In the wake of the 1967 rebellion, Dan and Dorothy helped to organize the People's Tribunal of the 3 police officers involved in the massacre at the Algiers Motel. In the late 1960s and early 70s, Reverend Dan organized alongside James and Grace Lee Boggs and was active in the struggle for community control of Detroit public schools as part of the All African People's Union. The AAPU put forth a plan called Education to Govern, which developed a curriculum for Black students that would give them the skills needed to transform the entire country, the economy, and themselves. Reverend Aldridge, thank you for being with us tonight.
My pleasure.
Next, we have Dr. Kefentse Chike. Dr. Chike was born and raised in Detroit, Michigan. He has over 30 years of combined experience as a teacher of social studies and professor of African American studies. Dr. Chike has taught in 2 of Detroit's premier African-centered schools, Aisha Shul and W.E.D. Du Bois Prep and the Soroma Institute, as well as various colleges and universities throughout Metro Detroit. He currently serves as a full-time faculty member of African American Studies at Wayne State University and Wayne County Community College District, having earned his master's degree in African American Studies Cultural Aesthetics at Temple University and a doctorate in African American and African Studies at Michigan State University. He researches African and African American education, African spiritual systems and spirituality, and Black African cultural identity formation. African drumming is a longtime passion. Dr. Chike is a proud father of 1 son. Thank you, Dr. Chike, for being with us tonight.
Thank
and
you.
last but certainly not least, Dr. Joyce Piert. Dr. Joyce do you go by AKA Dr. P?
I go by Dr. P, yeah.
Okay. Dr. P is an educational consultant and passion coach. As an educational consultant, she partners with organizations to support and strengthen families through African-centered curriculum development. She also is an experienced passion coach and provides her clients with life-enhancing skills through unique meta-awareness modalities. As a community and intellectual activist, Dr. P has been instrumental in the creation of several businesses that address the academic and interpersonal needs of youth and young adults. Dr. P is the author of several books, Alchemy of the Soul and African-Centered Education and Warrior Queen. She is committed to enhancing the life chances of children, youth, and adults from urban communities, as well as an educator and mindfulness advocate. Dr. P is an author, painter, and poetess. Thank you, Dr. P, and to all our guests once again.
Thank you for inviting me to this event. I'm excited.
So to start things off, I've mentioned African-centered education. And for some of us on this call, and for some of us in general, we don't really know what that entails. So Dr. Chike, Dr. P, if you and Aldridge, the Aldridges, if you have some insight into what an African-centered education is, could you give us some clarifying comments and help us explain that? That would be greatly appreciated, and I think it would help with the background moving forward.
Is there a particular order you want us to respond?
If you would like to go first, Dr. Chike.
I was gonna defer to the ladies.
No, you go. Oh no, you go ahead.
Well, African-centered education, first of all, I think there still needs to be clarity regarding the meaning, because it has more than one meaning depending on who you ask. My dissertation looked at the evolution of the African-centered education movement in Detroit from 1972 to 2000. The impetus for my research was the fact that the movement for African-centered education was greatly impacted by the emergence of charter schools and the charter school movement. So the earliest schools that we can call African-centered schools, that movement emerged out of the independent Black school movement. Independence, meaning private, no government funding, was a major tenet. And in Michigan, charters became prevalent in the early 90s. And two of Detroit's leading African-centered schools, which were independent, decided to become charter schools, and it caused a great rupture within the movement. Now, this is in the context of a national organization called the Council of Independent Black Institutions, which grew out of the Pan-African Congress and a series of other educators who began to meet in the early 70s to contemplate what education for African-American children should look like. By the time we get to 1995, there's a rupture within the organization. This is like the umbrella organization of African-centered schools, independent African-centered schools. And all of the philosophical and ideological fissures began to come out in that organization around the issue of whether or not independence was essential for a school to be independent. The impetus for my research was initially when I began to argue, not just to document the argument or this debate, but also I initially sought to argue that independence was essential to a school being, it was an essential criteria for a school being African-centered. By the time I finished my work, I decided, or I realized, that there are varying strands of African-centered education philosophy. So that's why I said it depends on who you ask in terms of what exactly African-centered education means. But a primary or an essential assumption undergirding the idea of African-centered education is that education plays, like Afrocentricity, or the more contemporary term, Africology, places at the center of analysis and knowledge production. And in this case, teaching and a dissemination of information, placing African culture and African people at the center. So in African-centered education, that means we operate from the premise of where Africa is African being centered in the teaching, in the knowledge production, the dissemination of knowledge and the like. And I hope that I've at least touched on answering the question.
Can I go next?
Absolutely.
Because Kefentse and I tend to, our research overlaps, and so we tend to work very closely together as we define this. So African-centered education, that model, it is centered in where the African is the center. But for me, I took it one step further because I'm an educator. So I needed to know what's the curriculum and what's the pedagogy, like what makes it African-centered? It's not an education model of education that just chocolate covered traditional public school education. It's different than that. And so that to answer that question, well, what was it? Well, when I did my research on African-centered schools, I found that the model of African-centered education that was happening in Detroit at the independent Black institutions that Kefentse mentioned, Aisha Shule is where I did my research. I found that there were components that had to be present in the African-centered school. And that curriculum had to be about nation building, spirituality, and cultural reclamation. And if those were not present in the African-centered school, then it was a diluted version of African-centered school. It was not the African-centered school model that was promoted by CB, which was the Council for Independent Black Institutions, and it was not the model that was initially promoted by Aisha Shule before they became a charter school. It had to have a curriculum that was specific to the needs of African people. And that meant that it was spirituality had to be there because African people understand that spirit is in all things. So spirituality undergirded that, and that's where we start. It also had to be about nation building at that time. And it was about how do you liberate African people in the diaspora and here. And so, on the continent. And it also had to be about, I need to know who I am culturally. It had to be about deep culture, and as Kefentse helped me understand, the surface culture. So those things had to be present, but it also had to have a pedagogy. And the pedagogy is, for the teachers and educators here, it's what is the methodology for teaching African-centered children? And what you have to know who they are socially. You have to know their worldview, the worldview of African people. That is, we live in harmony with the planet. We are social beings who work collectively. We're not competitive. So the competition that's in traditional public school is cooperation in African-centered schools. It's understanding the relationship that you have with the planet, and it's not domination and control over the planet. It's understanding that you are spirit, and spirit is in all things. It's understanding why little Black boys can't sit down, because they move, and so you have to give them space to move. It's understanding just this dichotomy of what's normalized for European American schools is not normalized. We're not chocolate covered Black people. White people. We're not chocolate covered white people. So you have to have a model of education that addresses who African people are culturally. And that number one question is that educational model has to be always centered, as Kefentse said, African people. The question that drives it is, how does this impact any phenomena? How does that impact Black people? Where were Black people when that was happening? Just like Nicole Hannah-Jones said, in 1619, where were Black people in 1619, right? So that's centering the experiences of Black people. So that's an African-centered educational model, has to have a curriculum and a pedagogy that addresses African people, who they are culturally, and who they are, their worldview, and who they are spiritually.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Reverend Aldridge or Mrs. Aldridge, would you like to have a chance to answer this question?
Well, actually, I would yield to the experts in this particular area. Although during our experiences in the 60s, we did do some things using Africa as a center of our thought and of our organizing. For instance, one of the things that we started off, we didn't have Freedom School as such, but we did teach African, or everybody wanted to learn African languages, primarily Swahili. And, so everybody at that particular time in the mid-60s were trying to explore without, being very, have an educational model. What does it mean to be an African person? And using that as a center of education. And also, my experience with education and dealing with educational inequality began about 1960 with the Northern Student Movement. And what we did at that time was brought college students into the community in the various areas to tutor young people in educational or whatever they determined was their educational deficiency. And it was a very successful project. We, by successful, I mean it was large. It was lots of young people involved. And my center place where I worked was at the Brewster Housing Projects, and got to meet a lot of different kinds of people in the Brewster Housing Project. And we worked on what we thought was educational inequality, and also how do we become critical thinkers. And one of the things, I sent an image to Peter we were at the voting machine, and one of the things we certainly taught at that time was civic literacy, and we encouraged folks to, like I said, at the time, learn what it meant to be a citizen, and a good citizen, or a person that enjoyed your community. So we did that, and that was one of the things we did. And also, a lot of the young people, I sent a second image to Peter, where we were packing a truck to go to Lowndes County, Alabama, in honor of Mrs. Viola Luzo, that had been killed in a voting rights effort in Selma, Alabama in 1965. And what was also important about that is that some of the 2T, and that's what we called them at that time, 2Ts, who were involved in the project with Northern Student Movement, went on to be involved in other voting rights activities and other activities supporting movements in the South. Also, in 1972, I went on a trip to the People's Republic of China, and one of the things we studied was their system of education, their system of medicine, and many things. For instance, when the medicine, we were allowed to go into the hospitals and see operations being done using acupuncture anesthesia. Now, of course, now you can't do these things because everybody's very high and very afraid of insurance and the like. But it was very interesting to see persons under acupuncture anesthesia who were talking while they were doing brain surgery, for instance. So that was really interesting, and there are various methods of all kinds of education. So also we had later on, all of this is carried on through various educational things that we did in Detroit. And we did have a freedom school in 1966 at Northern High School, where the young people there themselves were concerned that the principal was not giving them their best opportunities. So the students walked out of class and went down to St. Matthew, St. Joe's Church and formed a freedom school where they came to class. No pressure was made to them, and they were successful in getting rid of this particular principal at the time. So there are many, many efforts where young people and community leaders in Detroit took on the institutions of education and tried to make them work for them.
Thank you. Thank you. That actually is a fantastic segue to what was going to be my next question. And Reverend Aldridge, I will give you the opportunity to ask or answer first, as you being the panelist that has not spoken yet. And I would also encourage our audience, if they have questions for anyone, to feel free to put them in the chat box, and we will start interacting as quickly as possible with you all. So the next question for everyone, all of the panelists, would be, in what ways has education, and Mrs. Aldridge just touched on this quite a bit, in what ways has education been used as a liberation tool for African Americans in Detroit? Reverend Aldridge, I will give you the floor.
Well, let me say that following what the work that Dorothy and others did at Northern High School, in 1967, Detroit had a fairly small number of principals and administrators in the Detroit public school system. So I began in Martin Luther King High School. Now understand, King High School was actually organized because initially what they wanted to do was to not have too many black students at what was Eastern High School. So they essentially closed Eastern High School and opened up King High School primarily for blacks because blacks were moving into that neighborhood. When I moved over this way, working, I noticed that students were very dissatisfied. And so I began to organize the students there. And the teachers, trying to get black principals and the administrators. At that point, I was successful. I was fairly unsuccessful in some regards. Some of the principals and teachers did not have attitudes that were significantly different than the people they replaced. But one of the teachers who came to be influenced by us was I forget African name.
Imani Humphrey.
Imani Humphrey. She was the English teacher there. So I was the organizer of the young people in that school, both two schools, Central High School also. And one of the students who come out of our organizing was Wendell Anthony, who's now the head of the NAACP. And then Fanny Humphrey, she left school of King High and then went and formed Aisha Shule. So in some regard, there's a connection. We also organized a Freedom School, Episcopal Church on the Boulevard and Gratiot, with the students from King High School. We closed down King High School. But my work in this area of education came when I worked largely with James and Grace Boggs. We worked together. The education that governed, in my judgment, was largely written by me, but most people think about being something that created by James and Grace. Our notion was that education was to go. Why did people go to school in the first place? Many folk went for a job. We said, no, it had to be governed, it had to be connected with liberation. In that regard, I became good friends with Amilcar Cabral in Guinea-Bissau and met with him in New York. We were hooked up with Paulo Freire out of Brazil. And Freire went to Guinea-Bissau and set up liberation schools in the various camps in the country of Guinea-Bissau. So I was more heavily influenced by Paulo Freire, Amilcar Cabral, and also the work that was being done in Havana, Cuba, where I went to for a short period. The other thing where I was influenced, I would say, I think it was 1969, Dorothy and I and our little young daughter, we went to Jamaica, and we talked to and conversed with Amy John Garvey, Marcus Garvey's wife, at their home at 12 Mona Road. The two sons, they were out of the country at the moment. They were in England, but we spent time with Mrs. Garvey. We also spent time with a guy we call Bobby, or Bobby. He's now known as Dr. Robert Hill, who's the world's leading authority on Marcus Garvey. So while I would not consider myself Afrocentric in any way, I would consider myself more humocentric with an African consciousness. We certainly studied Africa quite a bit. I also became talking to and working with Kwame Nkrumah. And I was supposed to go to Ghana and spend time with Nkrumah, but what happened, he was overthrown. And those of us, the All African People's Union, were heavily influenced by Nkrumah. And in fact, the way we taught reading to students from King High, we taught through the writings of Kwame Nkrumah. And we also distributed Nkrumah's magazine, which came out in English, called Africa in the World. So while I would not call myself or see myself in any way as being Afrocentric, we have certainly had the teaching of about Africa and of the diaspora as a part of our teaching. Education to govern. We studied all of the major movements for liberation throughout the 20th century, and that was education to govern was the result. And our notion was that education was the purpose of governing, was for the purpose of obtaining freedom and liberation. In fact, I wrote a major article that was published in Monthly Review magazine about liberation, largely influenced by the work done in Cuba, and also my dealings with Amilcar Cabral and the works of Paulo Freire in Brazil.
Thank you. Dr. P or Dr. Chike, would you like to take a Reverend Jones? I will actually be coming back to the education to govern too, if we have time. But Dr. P or Dr. Chike, did you want to answer on how education and what ways education has been used as a liberation tool in Detroit. Dr. Chike, you're muted if you're going.
And he's the historian. He knows how that works.
I'm just part of a whole nother thing. So anyhow, I wanted to say Asante Sana, thank you to Baba Dan Aldridge and to Mama Aldridge as well. And I think, I think Baba Dan's contributions are just so huge. My work, as I said, looked at African-centered education like a slice of that, what maybe I would call Black education. And what I appreciate, along with your contributions, is in your response, you just expanded the context. And what I've been able to realize, just reflecting on my work, is even when we talk about African-centered education, we have to really think about this in a more holistic and a larger context. And some of the myths about Black education and about our history, particularly now that we're having this conversation about critical race theory, which is BS. I hope I'm not going too far off topic, but we're commonly told that the history of Black folks began in 1619 when 20 Black slaves stepped off of a ship in Jamestown. It was 20 enslaved Africans that stepped off a ship in Jamestown, and neither our culture nor our history began there. Nor did our ancestors come here uneducated. African civilization can be dated back at the earliest period is 4200 BCE, and it existed continuously for almost 7,000 years. No civilization can exist without some form of education to keep it going. Education is designed to perpetuate a society. I know I'm gonna get to the Detroit in 1 second. So even when our ancestors came here, it was not that we were not educated. We came here with skills that the enslavers could use and did use, like animal husbandry, rice cultivation, and other things. The problem was we didn't have the type of educated that suited the purposes that they needed us for. We've been taught we were not educated, and even on those plantations, after we were socialized to operate as enslaved people, we devised a whole nother system of education that contributed to our liberation. Examples of this would be Frederick Douglass, whose education and the fact that he educated himself took him very far. That's one example. Bringing it back to Detroit, and as I said, my work, the focus or scope of my work is 1972 to 2000, but I began with the antecedents of African-centered education. And the earliest reference point I have is when Black people started a school in 1839 in Detroit, Michigan. And they started that school because they were paying taxes in Detroit, but their children could not go to the public schools. Now that changed. Then I bring it forward to the Nation of Islam, who established the Universities of Islam in 1931 in Detroit. There was also, through Carter G. Woodson and Association for the Study of Negro History and Life, they were like African-American History Month. There was the chapter of Asala, what's Asala now in Detroit in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, through the Negro Bulletin and other programs. They educated African-American teachers in Detroit and had Black History Month programs and things like that to educate the teachers to try to implement a more effective education to the children in Detroit. Then you had a group on advanced leadership, which is Richard Henry.
Yes.
Milton Henry.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Richard and Mario Bedelli, which is Richard Henry and his brother. I can't think of his name now.
Milton Henry, Gaidi.
Just thank
Gaidi, yeah.
Reverend Albert B. Clay, Dan Aldridge was a part of this cohort of people. And they first are kind of advocating for integration in the schools in response to trying to expand upon Brown versus Board of Education. So in 1962, Richard Henry is on the front of the Chronicle protesting the use of racist textbooks in Detroit, Michigan, and refuses to let his children go back to the school. Kighton, I think it's Winterhalter Middle School. By 1966, the community control of schools movements is becoming in full effect. And that's when you get, you can correct me if I'm wrong or keep me honest, publications like Education to Govern and all kind of organizations, the Inner City Organizing Committee, the Citywide Citizens Committee, things like this, where brothers like Ed Vaughn, Dan Allen, Reverend Albert B. Clay are building teacher caucuses and things like this. And this kind of culminates, at least I think, in 1966, as our elder sister said, with the protests and walkout at Northern High School. And for me, this begins the student protest movement, which goes well into the early 70s, where students are walking out of school, walking into school board meetings, disrupting the meetings, demanding that they change the name of the schools and things like that. But I want to go back to Northern for a minute, because a lot of the white folks and other people dismissed the Northern protests, but Donald Coding, and I forget the sister's name that were kind of at the head of this, they weren't even arguing about the whole cultural piece. They were arguing that the test scores were lower, Blacks were not being placed in advanced placement classes, and they argued for discrimination. And then I think it's the Michigan Commission on Human Rights even investigated this. Ultimately, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I wanted to say that one of the students who was active that was Charles Colding. But I think something else that changed is that when SNCC was organizing in the South and the NAACP had been organizing, that there had been much organizing across the country, and many of us started to move. For example, I moved here, from Harlem, New York. The distinction is I was taught what we call Black history, African American history, early in the 7th grade. I was taught by John Henry Clark, and also Mr. Michaud, who had the African National Memorial Bookstore, which was on 125th Street and 7th Avenue, and also the Frederick Douglass Memorial Bookstore, which was run by Richard B. Moore, who was one of the founders of the African Blood Brotherhood. And so there were lots of other influences now, with many of us moving, when we finished college, moving across the country. Malcolm X and I had the same barber. When Malcolm X was assassinated, for example, supposedly there were people collecting money for Dr. Shabazz and the kids. The truth is, the first money that was given to Mrs. Betty Shabazz to take in, support her and the kids, was collected by the Citywide Citizen Action Committee, primarily Clyde Cleveland, Ed Vaughn, and myself. Ed Vaughn collected most of the money, and I'm the one, because I live in New York, who took the money to Betty Shabazz and the kids. That's the first money they got, and we took $150 in, which at that time was a lot of money, thought to be a lot of money. But people were collecting money, but she said they were not receiving any money for how they were living. I saw that. I was attached to Malcolm because Malcolm and I had the same barber, William Tyson, who, by the way, was waiting for Malcolm when Malcolm was assassinated. He heard about it on the radio. They had made a deal for Malcolm to get his hair cut on Sunday so nobody else would be in jeopardy. And it just so happens, while they killed him, Tyson, he was at the barbershop sitting there waiting for Brother Malcolm and learned about it on the radio. So I'm saying that you know, there are a lot of cross currents, and a lot of us, you know, work together. Dorothy worked very closely with Ed Vaughn, and I also, you know, worked very closely with Ed Vaughn. We bought, and Ed Vaughn provided books for many of us. I mean, there's no way of telling the number of people that Ed Vaughn actually educated. And also, we're talking about Malik Yakini. Malik Yakini was a young man who sold books at the bookstore. He worked behind the counter at Vaughn's bookstore. So a lot of us, you know, cross-pollinated. Dorothy was the deputy to Richard. What's his name, Dorothy? Richard, huh?
Not Richard.
Richard. You were deputy director, Richard. You know, Fanny's husband.
Oh, Richard Humphrey.
Richard Humphrey.
That's right.
Yes.
Yeah, Dick Humphrey. So I'm saying, while we differed all through this, we differed. For example, I was not a proponent of African-centered education, never was. But it didn't mean that those who were opponents, because we worked together on some things, and some things we didn't work together. But we always support each other. And the other thing is, we never really ever opposed each other, even though we had differences. And most of those differences were kept in-house, and we argued among each other. There was no fighting, physical fighting, even though we had debates among ourselves. So I would never consider myself what I call Afrocentric. I was not opposed to those who were, and I wore largely clothing made from Africa. So sometimes, you know, you can call yourself something and you can think yourself as something, but other people may see you in the other way, or they may see you differently. So I would say that we worked with, while we not support the PAC, we work closely with the PAC. We put on programs together with the PAC. We organize with people at Vaughn's bookstore and all across. So, you know, it's kind of hard to understand that we were a vigorous movement, and I would say the movement to me is still evolving in some way. For example, right now, I'm organizing, opening up a music school in Detroit on the corner of Aldridge and John R. Named for Kenny and Barbara Cox to teach music, and also to me that's a part. Detroit has a great musical history, and I worked producing jazz for 40 years. So that's why I'm in education and government. It takes lots of different things. We're also organizing at Church St. Matthew, St. Joseph. We're going to begin to teach healthy eating and healthy cooking and the like. We're completely redoing the kitchen, making a commercial kitchen. So, see, to me, this African, when you talk about education and government, it's not centered on one thing. It keeps being evolved. It keeps changing as people's needs and conditions change.
I'm sorry. I just want to surmise, if I may.
Please.
That, and as I listen to Mama Aldridge speak, this, and I said earlier, what becomes the African-centered education movement early on was the independent school movement. And the independent school movement grew out of the community control movement. Mm-hmm. And just to get into the genealogy, as Baba Dan did, Malik Yakini is at Vaughn's bookstore and teaching. He wasn't teaching in the DPS at the same time, but he goes from being a high school student, very actualized by none other than who taught him in middle school, Professor, is it Melvin Peoples that was at Eastern?
Yeah, Melvin Peoples.
Malik Yakini's middle school teacher, who really very much helped him to become conscious. And Malik goes to work at Aisha Shule, and then leaves Aisha Shule and forms Insurama Institute. But the most important thing I wanted to convey in my diatribe here is that one of the key words or key founding principles of Africology or Afrocentricity is African agency, or what Karenga calls self-determination. In another piece that I've presented, there's an African educational legacy where African people have asserted themselves in the realm of education as long as we have been on the planet. So I gave some examples from the struggle for liberation and education in Detroit, historical examples, but we have to think in a broader context as Baba Dan did, but making those connections to Africa proper, the continent of African diaspora. In many ways, Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed serves as a kind of ideological basis or foundation for African-centered education philosophy. So this is like, it's much larger than, I'm not saying anybody's saying this, than 1972 to 2000 or this is what we've been doing, and it's really just African people doing what African people have always done, educating ourselves in the world.
And, and continue to do. For instance, we named Ed Vaughn in various areas and contexts, and he's still in Alabama. He left Detroit and went to Alabama, and he's still working very hard to bring about Afrocentrism. I think he would say that in his hometown in Alabama, in Dothan, Alabama. In Dothan, where also the founder of the Museum of African American History, that's also his hometown. Yeah, his hometown.
Right.
If I could interject real quick.
Yeah.
You mentioned the community. You mentioned the community control movement. No, there's just such a wealth of knowledge, and it's so appreciated. And it's fascinating to listen to, and just a lot to wrap our heads around. The community control movement, could someone touch on that real quick and explain what that is? And then Dr. P, I kind of want to come back to you as Dr. Chike was discussing the pedagogy. If you could next come in and describe some more African-centered teaching styles and the benefits of those, as opposed to maybe what we would say a traditional, I'm putting in air quotes, education within the United States, or a Eurocentric education.
Well, let me just answer the one question you raised about much of the independent school movement began as a consequence, comes out of Brooklyn, New York. The battle of Brownsville.
Ocean Hill,
Brownsville. That struggle, and the struggle for blacks to have control over their schools, energized the nation. Some of that energy went into, I'll say it was in Chicago, where Chicago was very instrumental in organizing the black independent school movement. In large part, there was Hakeem Mahabudi, who I knew in Detroit as Don Lee. Who, by the way, he and I were born on the same day, same year. We used to laugh about it. But Don Lee organized that, and at the same time that he was just getting into publishing, you had Dudley Randall, who was doing the same thing in Detroit, beginning into publishing and working more with poets. So much of the independent movement, people are learning from each other all across the country. One final point I want to make that I think Kefentse made, that we often overlook the African contribution to the development of the United States, the development of rice as an industry, the development of tobacco, and development of sugar. All these are things which were developed by the Africans. I don't call them African slaves, I say Africans who were enslaved. So much of the economy of the United States is built off of the labor and consciousness of African people. There's no question about it. Without the whole economy through sugar, tobacco, and rice was founded on the work of Africans from the continent.
So,
And
I'm sorry.
and that goes out, and I'll say that goes back thousands of years, not just in terms of those who came here. That's the point I wanted to make in agreement with Kefentse, that we seldom talk about the thousands of years of African traditions in technology and its contribution to the economic development of the United States.
And you were asking about community control, and I see someone posted a piece by Preston Wilcox, who was one of the leaders of the community control of schools movement. And for somewhere between 66 and 70, maybe 3 or 4 years, there were these ongoing negotiations, meetings with the school board, New York Board of Education in the city of New York. Preston Wilcox was at the helm of this. It was mainly the Hispanic community and African Americans. Another important name to know from this period was Jitu Weusi.
Yes.
And they were in these ongoing negotiations. They had a whole platform, almost like a 10-point program of demands of what community control would look like, and that they wanted the control of the schools in the Black community and the Hispanic community to be turned over to the community. Jitu Weusi,
they had a full cultural arts program.
Jitu Weusi
in Brooklyn.
Jitu Weusi gets fed up with this. Essentially, the people that were fighting for this began to feel like they were getting jerked around by the establishment. Jitu Weusi pulls out of the negotiations in 1969, and he grabs a bunch of students that had dropped out of school, and I think it's 10 Claver Place. This becomes the East, which was a cultural center that had cultural, like a cultural component that sold different cultural artifacts, a jazz component. It was like a complete community cultural center. And there he forms the Uhuru Sasa School in 1970. And he was a
Wilcox.
Go ahead, sorry.
I'm adding, see, a lot of us are working together. I knew him from New York. I knew him by his given name. So I worked with him in New York through some of those of us who were radicalized in New York. Even before his later development, he did a tremendous job in New York. But we were also, through the Boggs, we worked with Jimmy and Grace Boggs, we were friends with Preston Wilcox. He was part of working with us in helping the right organization to govern. So all of us, many of us were working. My point is, many of us are working together across states and across the country, though we did not take and have all this written down. But I worked with Jitu Weusi. I worked with Preston Wilcox. Also worked with Felipe Luciano, who was the organizer of Young Lords. And the last poet. But I knew him through the Young Lords. He and I and Rap Brown worked together in New York. So all of us are working with each other. My point is, while we may call it something different sometimes, we're learning from each other, we're sharing from each other, and we're working across the country.
And man, I had a thought. So anyhow, community control kind of takes off. So it's going down in Washington, D.C. Versus community control. When people start creating these schools, you have a school pop up in East Palo Alto. And all of this is occurring in the context at the time the civil rights movement. And as a historian, I don't segment these movements. I'm more ascribed to the idea of the long Black liberation struggle. These are just different phases. All of this that we're talking about, Dan Aldridge, everybody else, is happening in the context at this time of the Black Power movement, in the Black Arts movement. The Pan-African Congress, under the leadership of Baraka Leroy Jones, who is kind of like the representative of us, the equivalent of Maulana Karenga on the West Coast. He's holding it down on the East Coast. They hold a series of meetings out of which comes a whole caucus of teachers that are now advocating or asserting that we need a different type of education for our children in a major debate. And this comes full circle. Do we educate our children in the existing schools and reform them? Or do we separate and form independent schools? That's how you get the birth of this independent movement. But interesting, as I go back to what happens in Detroit in the 90s, that same debate comes up again. Do we try to reform schools and public education, or is independence the key? And this is it. Just for me, it has to be contextualized in a holistic way, where it's part of a whole big. It's just how African people operate, how we continue to operate. I don't know if I answered your question about community control of schools, but
I thank you so much. I want to make a note real quick and let everyone know that Dr. Blackmer is posting a bunch of background information in the chat. So to give more background onto some of the topics you all have touched on, there's some more reading you can do. I want to be aware of timing and give Dr. P a chance to maybe get to funnel some of this broader topics into, like I said, funneling it down into a day-to-day pedagogy, or how African-centered education or thinking can be used on a weekly, daily basis.
Okay, so John, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to give you what you asked for. And let me tell you why. It's because I know African-centered education. So, and for me, it starts with a philosophy. And that philosophy is built around African psychology, and it's what's our cosmology, what's our axiology, like cosmology, how we view and see ourselves in the universe, what's our axiology, what are our values, what's our ontology, what's our epistemology, how is knowledge, all of that we need packet before we can even begin to craft and create an African-centered education, because that's the foundation. I don't know if you read Marimba Ani, she talks about the asili, the spirit. That's the foundation that has to undergird this educational experience. I'm going to tell you about my findings on the educational experience, so that those who are interested in wondering what this education should look like, this is what it should look like. As I said, it's built on African spirituality. There's ancestor veneration. Children are blessings. Now, that's kind of, I don't know how, Western culture, we got these old fights about, how we value children. Ancestor veneration is not ancestor worship. It's that we know that there are shoulders that we stand upon. And so we honor those who have come before us. Nation management, policy setting, nation maintenance. The children are taught this. The children were taught that they could manage nations, that they could set policies, that they could govern nations. They were in the 6th grade being taught this. Now, I don't know about y'all, but I didn't get taught that. And so I was like, whoa. And so, but they, and I have quotes, but one of them said, this is something that we were never told implicitly or explicitly that we could not do. And so activism was a fundamental part of that they were always involved in walkouts, and they were involved in, when Nelson Mandela came to Detroit, they were right there in welcoming Nelson Mandela. So they were put in the middle of anything that was happening. They were made aware that they could be a part of that. Family and community. It was the Shule itself the children called the female teachers mama and the male teachers baba. And in their quotes, they said the benefit of that was it allowed them to form community, right? And that they were with many of those teachers more than 1 year. And Kefentse taught there, so he knows, this experience himself. And there were young men, young brothers who were saying, for those young men who did not have a father in the home, the Shule offered them a space where they had a male role model. And then they had rites of passage. So they had brothers who were helping them move into these different stages of personhood. And so this community upheld them and supported them. And that was formed and shaped in the Shule. They also had people who, the people who taught them went through their own re-Africanization. Now that's one of the challenges of African-centered schools is you have the people who are teaching this themselves have to be re-Africanized. They got to deal with their own white supremacy. And they can't say, well, oh no, I'm not. If you went to a white national, if you went to a traditional public school, that's a white national school, you were white supremacist and you got to deal with that. And you got to go in and do your own digging and your own cleaning of yourself, right? And so you need your own re-Africanization. So you can't teach children how to be African if you don't know, right? And so this was a part of what this is what their educational experience offered. So you get young people who know who they are. So when they graduated, the Shule was graduating students, independent Black institution would graduate, all the students that they graduated went to college. And that became the challenges. For me, the challenge was, what is the end goal of this educational experience? Because we talk about liberation, but if you go to college and begin to work for corporations, is that liberation? Are you liberating Black people? Are you a Pan-African? Or have you had a chocolate covered experience that just allowed you to be better able to assimilate? And so that was my question at the end of the research that I did. But the one thing I did learn was you cannot have anything that's other than an African-centered curriculum and pedagogy taught by a person who's been re-Africanized is a diluted form of an African-centered education. And it's a model of education when it's diluted, that's going to do exactly what traditional public schools do. And so you have to be more intentional and you got to think this through. We've had movements, yes, we have, but what is the end goal? And here's my question, y'all can answer. We say, what we want to teach our children to liberation. My question is, what is liberation? In 2022.
I can answer that question.
Okay, please do.
Great question. Thank you, Dr. P.
Well, let me say, first of all, that right now in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, there's a program taught where they teach African American history and culture. It's the only place in the United States that I know of where it's a part of fundamental culture. The people who put that program together is Dr. Carr, who's head of the program of African Studies at Howard University. They have a full and comprehensive program of teaching African and African American history to the people the students in Philadelphia. It's the only place like that. I say that education has to be to govern. Liberation has to be free. It has to be free thinking. It has to be being a critical thinker. And to me, that has to be the role of education. It can be spiritual for some people. Some people it's not spiritual. Spiritual is just being spiritual as a minister of some 40 years. Spirituality is just one part of it. It may not be the most important part for everybody. It's broader than that. For some people, that works, and for other people, that does not work. So I think it has to be much more comprehensive, and what I would call, rather than Afrocentric, I would call humocentric. So you can be humocentric with an African consciousness, which I think is slightly different. But all this, to me, is moving toward liberation, is moving toward as Kefentse said, is moving toward having self-determination in terms of the governing of our lives. And I think it seems to me that's what we're working for, and we're trying to find, and we're having to do that by different methods and different mechanisms because the task is comprehensive.
Thank you. I see in the chat, thank you, Reverend. I see in the chat that Zachariah Davis, you got a question for Dr. P. Ask away if you want to unmute yourself and ask, or just type it, either way.
Thank you. And this is Zakaria.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. But I did hear her say that she feels like teachers need to be re-Africanized in order to teach Black students, about being African. So it made me wonder if she feels like private schools in the US, I know they give like a quote unquote better education, but are they a good option for Black students?
My question would be, well, what is the objective of the education? And that drives. So if we're talking about liberation of Black people, then any school that you go to, private or not, is a traditional educational model. It's a white nationalism model. You're going to learn about, it's a Eurocentric. You're going to learn about, manifest destiny. You're going to learn about president. You're going to learn about Greece and Rome were the beginning of civilization. You're going to learn that. So the question becomes, Zachariah, what is the goal of the education?
Dr. P, it's Zakaria. I messed up.
Oh, Zakaria.
So I apologize.
What did I call you?
Zachariah. It's okay.
I'm so sorry, sis. It's Zachariah. I mean, it's Zakaria. I'm so sorry.
This is Reverend Dan. I don't subscribe to that notion. In fact, I know it's not so. Because that would mean that you can teach African and African American history and culture, and Paulo Freire's ways of educating people to govern. You can do that in schools, in public schools, or you can do that in schools which are not public. I prefer to work in public schools because most people are going to be going to public schools, and you can have an education which is not white nationalist, which does not begin with how you see it. I don't see things that way at all.
Well, can I answer that? Yeah. So,
yes, please. I was going to push in too.
So what I do is I teach pre-service teachers how to teach math, how to teach mathematics. And let me just say, my experience with our children is that Black and brown children go into, and I know this personal, intimately, go into these environments, and they are hostile environments, and they're violent environments, and their souls are bruised and wounded. And the reason why I say that relationship is important to our children. And so, and our children, they thrive on community. And when they go into environments that are being taught by people who are not in their community, who don't understand who they are culturally, then that is, and children are vibrational, so they can read. Like, you can tell me all day you like me, I already know you got a problem with me. I already know you don't think I can learn, I already know. And so they don't have the language for that, but they can feel that. And oftentimes those are the ones that act out. And so I'm just saying that I would like to say that our children can continue in these schools and that they'll thrive and survive, but there are many of you who've gone through this school system, and you know yourself what the experience has been, and you know what young people are going through now.
Yeah.
Please.
That's why we have the experience to teach them differently.
I'll make sure it's short. All I want to say is the emerging questions and the divergence goes right back to that initial difference about where we should educate our children and how we should educate them. It also, for me, goes to the question, or of the ambiguity, or the issue of the ambiguity around what does African-centered education mean? Most of us go to school. The education is really a credentialization process. We tell our children, do good in school, go to school so you can go to a good school, so you can get a good education to do what? To get a job.
Be a good job.
So you can have access to the economy. It has nothing to do with you becoming the person. This goes to the spiritual. It has very little to do with bringing out of the person, that spiritual being, what was put there by the Creator, and educing that out. I could say more, but I won't.
I appreciate that. As an educator in the public school system, I am looking inwardly and seeing across this country the attack on the new hot language of CRT, and the ability for teachers, even in the public sector, who want to teach African history or have these conversations about any other type of history other than Eurocentric school of thought, is being attacked, and public educators are being handcuffed into teaching what the powers that be or whoever is in charge want to be taught. So I guess there is that notion of being able to just go to school and get a job, but there's also this idea that we are doing a disservice to our students by not allowing them to have a full and well-rounded education. So if you would all want to talk on any of that, we got about 8 minutes left. I want to be conscious of people's time. So
John, I can say quickly, this is Reverend Dan. Look, what we've got to do is fight for the right to teach the truth. What we want to do, we want to teach the truth, and we want to teach people critical thinking skills so they can access the truth. And we're going to have to fight for that right, because much of the country is now taken over by a right wing, which is totally negative and against teaching the truth, because they don't want to know the truth of American history. They don't want to know the truth of world history. They don't want to know the truth. So we're going to have to fight and organize the way we always have to do. It's no different. You're going to have to continue to fight. We're not going to inherit this. We're going to have to organize and mobilize for our children. I'm for those of us, for example, very quickly adopting the schools in our neighborhoods. Rather than say, well, either go to charter school or nothing. No, we need to fight for control, for agency by our students, and for our students to be free thinking.
I want to respond, but I want to let the ladies respond first. And I'm not being chauvinistic. I'm trying to be fair.
Appreciate that.
Well, listen, I'd like to know, are there any more students or in the class that would like to ask a question?
Well, there's a question on the table.
There's nothing else new in the chat.
Nothing new in the chat. Okay.
Please enter if you have any more questions.
Dr. Piert, or did you have something? The whole CRT issue is a sham. It's a sham. Critical race theory is not taught to children in K through 12 schools. It is part of the same effort of the radical right wing to suppress the vote of Black people and other people. And in essence, I would like to use a metaphor or an analogy. It's on par with one couple in a marriage or a relationship that refuses to take responsibility for the all of the crap they bring into the relationship. So this is white folks refusing to own their mess. So they want to whitewash history. And this is not the first time that this has happened. At the, as Reconstruction came to a close around 1876, shortly after there, you get the Daughters of the Confederacy working in tandem with the Ku Klux Klan. This organization comes together and takes over school boards. We see this happening today. Right-wing politicians and activists going into school boards. And what they did in the 1800s, they injected themselves into these school boards and began to dictate the curriculum. And they came up with a curriculum that totally whitewashed the whole experience of enslavement and the narrative about the Civil War and the Confederacy. And all they did is they're reaching back into their handbook to do it again. And in my opinion, I don't mean to offend anybody here, this is people feeling like they have to do whatever they can to sustain their power. Unfortunately, not enough of us know the history or really understand the depth. And what they have that a lot of us don't have is control of institutions, which is where the power resides that will enable them to succeed at this again.
Thank you. Dr. P, I see you mentioned they have to close the schools in our neighborhoods. Could you?
No, I was just, when Reverend Aldridge was talking about, adopting schools. Well, we ain't got none. I'm from Flint, and they basically shut down. So we can't claim our children are going to charter school. So we can't claim schools in our community. That's one of the reasons why I say, who are our children connecting to? As a parent of a 5-year-old, and I put this out here. Think about this. Mothers, you got 5-year-old, they're babies, you love them. We go to the store, you don't let them talk to strangers. Yeah, pull them right back when they 4, pull them right back. They get 5, you send them to school. Do you know the teacher? No, you don't know nothing about the teacher. You don't know what their arrest records are. You just assume. The state tell you they're good to go, and you just assume. Your child don't know that person. And you have protected your child up to that point. You send them into an environment with strangers, people they don't know. And somehow you think just because the state sanctions it, that is okay. That child your child is defenseless. They don't have a gun. I'm sorry, I don't want to give kids. I'm just talking. They ain't got no mental health strategies, They are trying to deal with another human being who is a stranger to them, who you have kept them from. And now you send them into spaces that are volatile and violent and hostile. And you send them there and you leave them. And then when they come home, right? And they say, well, Mrs. Jones don't like me. So, oh, baby, no, that's all right. Miss Jones good. They are reading, right? But I'm saying, we say we love our children and we send them to strangers. And in many cases, our enemies, right? And Malcolm said, he was talking about the Germans and the Jews, but he said, who would allow their enemy to raise their children, teach their children? What are we thinking? And we have to, we have to take responsibility for that. There's no achievement gap. What's wrong is our children are in hostile environments and they're struggling. I've talked to young people say, I feel like an other. I'm othered and nobody sees me. And we send them there and then we tell them, oh, baby, I love you. Do you? I said, I'm on my soapbox.
That's why we have to mobilize and organize, begin to take back our schools. We're not going to do it by running away. We're not going at all.
Sorry,
or giving up and surrendering.
Dr. Jones-Obang, you have a question.
Yes, I had kind of maybe a quick question. First off, thank you for all the panelists for coming out today. It's been very enlightening. I have learned so much today from all of your comments and life histories. So I guess more of looking perhaps towards the future and even maybe gleaning towards solution. I was pondering through this panel discussion and thinking about what your guys' thoughts would be of social media. And if you thought social media could be a tool to help educate those that perhaps wouldn't be able to go to our African-centered school. I know my stepson, some of my students have mentioned learning crazy things on TikTok. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about perhaps using social media as a tool of educational liberation.
Can I step into that real quick?
Yeah, can I say that we put like, I'm gonna put like a 2-minute, I'm gonna keep time.
Oh yeah, I'll be real short.
I just want to be aware of everyone's time and make sure we get out of here at relatively close to 7:30, like I said. So go ahead, please.
I'll be real short. We are in a new day. And I know all of y'all know that, right? There was a time that we did not see ourselves with virtual education, right? Or we thought it was blown way off. We are now 2 years into virtual education. It's never going back the way it was because we've tasted, right? And so your children are learning. Children will learn. Children don't really need curriculum, y'all. They just need to be interested and curious. They will learn. And so what's happening is we're moving into a future of technology. So you might as well get ready. Yep, TikTok. What you need to teach them is how to be intelligent and critical about what they look at. That's it. Because it's on and popping. So I just wanted to say that.
Thank you. Dr. Chike, do you want to address it?
I think she really said it in a nutshell. I don't think it's putting the horse, any possibility of putting the horse back in the barn. I think to the degree that we need to devise ways to utilize social media in our interests. Like there's a video, if people have not seen this, I urge you to look at The Social Dilemma on Netflix. And it really shows how Zuckerberg and other Madison Avenue type people are really exploiting us and our children. I mean, some of you saw the whistleblower on Congress that she worked for. She worked for Facebook.
Right.
So we need to devise ways, and I think there are some Black people, some of us that are doing it, but I think the most important thing we can do, and in my time, I'm 62 years old, and I've been teaching college students for at least 22 or 23 years. And the one thing that I see that's not being taught that we learn in K through 12 is critical thinking skills. So I totally support what Dr. Piert said.
Reverend or Mrs. Aldridge, do you have any comments?
Well, just very quick, let me suggest that if you have access to YouTube, that you check out the teachings of Dr. Carr. They from Howard University. They run a full program where they're teaching comprehensively African and African American history. It's extraordinary.
I think the program is called Narrative with a K.
Right, Narrative with a K. And it's called Narrative with a K, and I forget the young lady, the woman's name who's teaching with him, but they do extraordinary work. They cover the full scope of Africa and the world actually. And he's a PhD and a lawyer, and he went to Tennessee State, where I went, and they do extraordinary work. It's one place I know where they do some exceptional stuff.
I think the young lady's name is Karen Hunter. Yes.
Karen Hunter, right.
She's written several books on business, and she's a talk show host on Sirius XM Urban View. But that union, if you will, is a result of her first bringing Dr. Carr onto her radio show, which is on during drive time, like something like 3 to 6 o'clock on Sirius XM Urban View. And what's grown out of that is this, what they call narrative. It's about 1,500 people across the country that are involved in this doctors, teachers, parents, and they do a host of sharing of resources and information. And Dr. Carr is a very committed educator. You mentioned the what's happening in Philadelphia. Dr. Carr wrote that first curriculum, the African American history curriculum, which the state later required to be taught to Philadelphia students. And he was a graduate of Temple University. That's where he got his PhD.
Thank you. Dr. Blackmer actually dropped the link in the chat. It is 7:35. Mrs. Aldridge, did you want to have any last comments? I'm going to give everyone a chance on the panel to have some closing words, plug anything that you would like to plug. Mrs. Aldridge, I don't know if you want.
Well, what I'd like to say, I'm sorry, that's talking over you, but the struggle continues. I mean, there was a time where we thought in the early 60s and so on that we would work so long and then we would go back to our lives. But no, that's not happening, and that's the same thing as the genie is not going to go back in the bottle. We have to continue to struggle and find ways to bring humanity to all people, all over the globe. And as Dr. King once said, we're going to have to learn to work together or perish as fools. And that's just where we are at the moment in, I believe, in human history. So we all should link together and put our minds together and see how we can resolve some of these issues that confront human beings, humankind.
Yes, thank you. Did you want to plug your tours at all?
Well, I could say that the Michigan Coalition for Human Rights, and you can look it up and have a website, are planning a tour for this summer around June 20 to go to the South. And the idea of doing the tours was to learn from the struggles where they took place, for the most part, in the rural South. And that's what we do. We take the young people to the rural South and learn what we can learn to apply to our issues of the day. So Michigan Coalition for Human Rights, feel free to look it up and give the call and see if you have students that are interested in going on the tour. Mm-hmm.
Dr. Blackmer actually put a link in the chat. Did any of the other panelists have any closing remarks or anything that they wanted to let everyone else know before we close up?
If I may, I would like to suggest that you all consider a follow-up to this in some context. But I also strongly urge you that you have Mama and Baba Aldridge in some similar setting where they are the primary focus, just because of the work that they've done. I mean, you couldn't even get it in. And I mean, even to have them share a panel with them, it's just because they've just done so much. And I also want to acknowledge, I don't know if he's still here, but I wanted to thank Dr. Akofer. I saw his image. Of course, you all may have already mentioned he's the chair of the Africology and African American Studies Department, but I wanted to thank him personally. I had the opportunity to work at Eastern for a couple of years. So I wanted to thank him and acknowledge him for the work he's done being at the helm of the department there as well.
And if I could,
just want to go ahead.
No, I just want to speak to the educators that are here. If I could, I just want to encourage you to reimagine education. We're in a time where it doesn't have to be the way it was. And like you you can do so much just rethinking how we have been doing it. So I just, and I want to encourage you, all is not, the end of the world. It's a good opportunity. COVID was good for us because it gave us the opportunity to rethink how we educate our children and to get a chance for some of the parents to see what you were dealing with. So yeah,
Thank you.
that's all.
I wonder reiterate what Dr. Kefentse said, and that's about this narrative with Ms. Hunter and Dr. Carr. His narrative with a K. I don't know how you access it. I see it I get it on YouTube, but it's extraordinary. The range they cover, the depth they cover. They begin to talk about Africa from the very beginning of time all the way up to the day. They cover books, they cover resources, and it's extraordinary. Also, we want to encourage us to see if we can get Detroit to adopt the model that they have in Philadelphia for teaching African American history.
Yes, I know that the state of Michigan does not have a.
I'm sorry, Jonathan, if I could, I'm sorry. We would be remiss to overlook the work that was done in DPS, because Detroit Public Schools, I saw one article that Dr. Blackmere posted, which referenced Paul Robeson and Malcolm X Academy. But the whole time that the African-centered education movement was flourishing, evolved, and all of that in Detroit, there was a movement occurring at the same time in Detroit public schools under the guidance of people like Catherine Blackwell, Norman McCray, Dahir Shabaka. So I think I'm not dissing Philadelphia, but Detroit has done some very monumental things that are on par, if not beyond that. But what Philadelphia has done, they've made this a requirement for graduation, and that's important.
Thank you for mentioning that.
Welcome.
Let me
just mention one other person. You know the name Harold Lawrence Kofi Wangara?
Yes.
Yeah, he taught history over at Mackenzie. He's an extraordinary teacher. He's also one of the ones who worked on the book, They Came Before Columbus. That's another whole story that I could talk about, because I worked on that with him. And but that's another whole story. But I'm saying that there are things that we can definitely do. And I'm for, when I say the Philadelphia model, I'm for having it institutionalized and being a requirement.
I think they're trying to get us to wrap up. Jonathan's been trying to get us to close this out, I think.
I appreciate it. I love I just, I want to be conscious of people's times, and in case
there's never enough time, right?
Never. This has been amazing, and I appreciate it. I just want to thank you all so much for the knowledge and wealth and depth that you've brought today. I wish we had more time and we could go into this and continue to hear these conversations. And so I appreciate you saying, do some research on your own and continue to learn, because we are lifelong learners. I just want to thank you all again.
We want to thank Dr. Blackmer as well for organizing the panel.
That's my next one. Dr. Blackmer, thank you. Dr.
Right.
Thank you. Ashley Reynolds, thank you. She's my fellow GA. She helped me out so much. I want to thank Africology, the African American Studies program, for putting this event together, and thank the department chair, Dr. Okafor. This has been a great experience, and I just am truly excited and blessed to be in this position that I'm in, and in this education and learning. So thank you all for showing up. Everyone that's still here in the audience, thank you for tuning in. If you have anywhere to drive tonight, stay safe out in the snowstorm.
Goodbye.
Mm.
Peace.
Take care.
Thank you all for
Peace.
being here.
So much.
Thank you as well. Peace.
Thank
Be
you.
safe.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you, Dorothy. All right, good work, y'all.
That's good job.
Great job, Jonathan. That was so good.
Chill out with the Jonathan. I feel like I'm in trouble every time I hear it. Thank you. Oh, I just didn't know. I felt it.